Live from Shore Manor Studios, this is Tales from a Small Town Journalist with Matt Shore.
Hey guys, thanks for checking out this episode of Tales from a Small Town Journalist, the podcast dedicated to all the weird and wonderful stories you are only going to hear about from reporters working in small communities just like yours. I'm Matt Shore, and I was one of those small town reporters for almost 10 years before I finally hung up my camera and my notepad. And in that time, I had some pretty interesting experiences working with the public, and I got to know a lot of other reporters who also had some interesting and sometimes weird experiences working with the public. Before I go any further, I do want to make sure and mention that this is a listener-supported podcast, supported by wonderful folks just like you. There are some great ways that you could show some support. One is a newly launched Patreon page, patreon.com/Matt Shore. You can pay that a visit and check out a lot of my spooky ghost stories that I publish there, as well as the occasional blog. Another great way to show some support would be just to go visit my website, www.mattshore.net, and check out the bookstore over there. We've got books for young and old readers. We've got comic books. We've got horror. We've got sci-fi, a little bit of everything over there. So check that out, see if there's anything you like. And finally, just help spread the word, tell everybody you know about this crazy little podcast. Tell a friend, tell a neighbor, tell a loved one. Use Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and even the new kid on the block, use TikTok if you've got it. Go tell everyone about this crazy podcast and the crazy stories that we have to tell. This is our year-end episode, and we're resuming the tradition of bringing Lee Landini Wright, Assistant Professor of Journalism from Murray State University, to do kind of a year-end review of the news for, America and local communities in the area. There were some pretty significant things that happened this year, not least of which is, of course, the COVID pandemic, the vaccines that came out, and of course, the January 6th, the uprising and insurrection that we had in Washington, D.C. And these, even though they were kind of national stage things, they permeated down, and we felt their impact at the local level. So there was a lot of local journalism impacted by this. And so that's one of the things that we're going to talk about, because one of the biggest things that really affected all of this, and in my opinion is becoming a huge problem, definitely in America and probably worldwide, is just misinformation over things. Like all the way back January 6th, that was a result of misinformation. And current problems that we're still dealing with, the COVID pandemic as well as the vaccines, as the problems we're facing there, that is really the result of misinformation. And people are trying to find a way to combat it, and I don't think they've found one yet. And personally, I don't have a good answer either. But it's an ongoing thing, and that's one of the things that we're going to talk about. It's a great discussion and an interesting look back on the year that was. So let's shift gears now and go chat with Lee Landini Wright. This episode is brought to you by Moby Dick Back from the Deep, the webcomic chronicling the white whale's return in modern times as a zombified beast. This terrifying high seas adventure boasts more than 78,000 viewers, 4 successful Kickstarter campaigns, and numerous mentions on comic book and horror podcasts, e-zines, and more. Check out this monstrous tale at backfromthedeep.com if you dare.
Okay, I'm joined by Lee Landini Wright, Associate Professor from Murray State University, teaching journalism. We've chatted before. We didn't manage to last year. Life just got in the way, but I've always liked checking in with Lee about just the year in journalism and just the big topics and how they've impacted us at all levels. So we're going to do that again, keep that tradition alive. So Lee, thanks for joining me once again.
Well, thanks for having me. It's always a treat to be asked to come on this show and talk about journalism, especially when we're talking about journalism, how it affects us in these smaller towns and regions like Western Kentucky and West Tennessee and Central and Middle Tennessee.
All too often, I think local journalism gets overlooked because people get so worked up over the national headlines. But I've always told me when they ask, which journalists do I trust the most? And I always tell them the local ones. Those are the ones I trust.
I definitely agree, because the local journalists, we're the ones, and I still say we, even though I'm not actively reporting like I used to when I worked at Paducah Sun for 16 years, but I still say we because I feel like I'm still in it, because I'm teaching it and I'm advising students who are going into this field. But I do think that here at the local level, we definitely have our ear to the ground. We are reporting the stories in our community that matter. And we can hopefully do a better job of reporting than sometimes the national headlines.
I agree. And I think all too often people have this misconception about journalists because they just think of the TV journalists and think they all are just like, I don't know, super wealthy or something. And it's like, well, maybe the Anderson Coopers of the world are, but really your local ones, they're right there, blue collar level, right with the rest of us.
Exactly. They're the ones who, they're going to the ball games, they're going to the city council meetings, they're going to these school board meetings. They're interviewing people, as they're doing interesting projects in a town. They're reporting on issues that matter at the local level. And of course, obviously, COVID has been probably the biggest story of the year.
Easily.
Easily. I think all of us were hoping, 2020 to 2021, it was sort of like magically, maybe it'll just vanish. Well, unfortunately, I think 2021 said to 2020, here, hold my soft drink.
Yeah, it looked like for a couple months we were on that road, but then the Delta wave hit us. Yeah.
The Delta did do us in. Thankfully, right now, at least in my area, we're kind of at a little bit of a lull. I have good hope, but of course, I'm not going to speculate on what this will do. As we've learned, speculating on this virus only gets us into more trouble.
Yeah, right now things look positive here too, where I'm at. Numbers are decreasing. That's as much as I want to say. I don't want to jinx it.
Right. Because then, when people do get on and talk about that, that is where I think some of the misinformation comes from. And I really think that, besides COVID, misinformation has been one of the biggest stories of the year because it has contributed to all of the big stories of the year. So, COVID, the vaccine hesitancy, the issues with the booster shots, who's eligible, who's not, the misinformation also, of course, with a lot of the political issues going on, the Capitol insurrection, as well as the critical race theory. Yeah, I think there's also been some misinformation about critical race theory when you look at what's happening on the national level with it. And then reporters have actually interviewed people. What do you know about critical race theory? And some of the people who are proposing the legislation against critical race theory can't even define it. And so that gets reported as well. So those, I think, are the three issues that we've had this year with the misinformation. And on the local level, I think that there's more trust with the local journalists because we're the ones who are out there reporting on what's happening in our community. And so we're talking to our local experts. We're talking to, like here in Murray, Dr. Hughes, who's also our chief medical officer here at Murray State. He actually has a Facebook page he's been running, the Callaway County Coronavirus, where he is sharing information with the public as a way to educate and hopefully encourage people about getting vaccinated. Of course, if you read the comments on that, of course, there's often people are like, I'm not going to get vaccinated. I don't believe this, etc. So he kind of went straight to the people, but he's also been willing to do interviews with the Murray Ledger and Times and the Murray State News about the need for everything going on, everything from when we first got the vaccines to the boosters. And I mean, he's been a fantastic local source of knowledgeable information, rather than, a reporter interviewing somebody's grandma's second cousin's roommate's best friend who got it off Facebook.
Yeah, and that's a key with local journalism, like the trust that's there, and in my opinion, really should be there because, like this you're talking about here, they're interviewing somebody from their community who has a stake in how things happen. Like, I'm not knocking Dr. Fauci here, but it certainly means a lot more when I hear a doctor who I know and I've had experience with, and I know I can trust this guy beyond just his credentials, telling me, hey, this is safe, it's effective, this is what you really, really need to do. It's going to carry a bit more weight with me than Anthony Fauci. If I knew him personally, it might be different. But I think that's the key with community journalism, and again, with everything. Why I always tell people who's most trustworthy, who's most reliable. It's your community journalists. They're the ones who have a stake in how things go in your community.
Exactly, exactly. And then sometimes, especially when you're talking about Fauci, some of those interviews, you would see like a clip on one channel that said one thing, and then the clip was different on another cable channel. And I think that also contributed to a lot of the misinformation. People were like, so what's going on? And the other thing with this, and it's just like anything, any type of news and breaking news, the information changes. You and I have both been reporters. We know that especially in a breaking news situation, it's going to take some time to kind of sort it all out. And the one thing with our news cycle now, it's so, fast, 24/7. It's now social media. It's just constant news cycle that it's hard to take the time to verify the information. And sometimes that story is changing. And I think that's also what's led into a lot of the misinformation and the mistrust. I think a lot of people no longer trust media at all. And that's one thing I've been trying to work on in my classes, is trying to teach my students how to build trust with their audience, because they're the next ones going out to be these community reporters. They're not starting at CNN and ESPN and big major outlets. They're starting at somewhere like the Murray Ledger or the Mayfield Messenger, or, a small TV station or a small radio station. They're starting small. They're starting in a community, and many of them will end up staying in their communities like we did.
Yeah. And you talk about social media mistrust. I think social media has hurt news in a lot of ways, simply because of the way it's just, like you said, it's simply true that with the news cycle, information doesn't come out in one big dump. A lot of times it trickles out. And in the past, when you had time in between newspapers or in between broadcasts, you had time for things to trickle, sort them out, maybe not perfectly, but you had a bit more time. Whereas now it's like you're expected, I think, with Twitter, Facebook, everything out there, get it up there, get it out. Otherwise, somebody else is going to post it. Well, then the story naturally changes. And it's not that anybody was dishonest the first time. It's just they didn't have all the information. And then people look back at that one's like, well, you lied to us. It's like, well, no, they just didn't have all the details. And I don't have a solution for that. It's just it's something that they haven't been able, it's hurt. That I guess that's really all I'm trying to say there.
Yeah, it definitely has hurt. And there's so many different cases you could look at in the headlines. Some of it also is the reporters need to do a better job sometimes with that follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
A difference between someone saying they were unvaccinated or had natural immunity. Something like that. Asking a better question, a better follow-up could have saved a lot of the misinformation on some cases like that.
Yeah, easily. And that's one of those things you've just got to get it. It's got to become muscle memory or instinct, where it just hits you the moment you hear one answer, you know exactly what you need to follow up with. And that's a hard thing to learn. You're going to learn it through experience. And I probably wasn't even all that great at it, but it's a vital skill.
It is a vital skill. And I think the other thing with that right now is reporters are being asked to do so much now.
Yeah.
It's now you're also reporting your first breaking stuff on social media, whether it's Twitter or Facebook, depending on what your outlet uses. And then you're putting it in the paper, and then you're putting it online, or you're putting it online and then in the paper, and then broadcast. Obviously, you're having to, have that package ready for the 5, 6, and then another version at the 10. So it's constant busyness. And you might not have time to go back and ask that follow-up question like we could have when we were both reporters. And we had a little bit of time in between editions to be like, okay, let me go and ask that question again, or let me follow up.
Yeah. And just speaking of the social media platforms, most of them have multiple ones, like 3, 4, 5 at a time that they've got to update. So yeah, I can only imagine because I was on the front end of the social media impact. I can't even begin to imagine how overwhelming it would be to me if I tried to go back.
Right. And especially in a small town, like your small town journalists, they're having to do all their own. In the larger cities, there's an online or social media news desk, and though they have producers or digital producers handling that. But, somewhere like in Murray or Paducah, your reporter is having to do it all. And it's hard. It's hard. And the other thing is, we're losing audience to social media. That's where people are going to get their news instead of, subscribing to their paper or listening to their radio or watching their TV. They're going to social media first because we all have our phone and we just hit the scroll, and find out on, Facebook or Twitter or Instagram's not really used as much for news. And then TikTok is now the new social media monster that has emerged. And I've seen the Washington Post. They are using TikTok and they're kind of doing some really fun things with it. But then, TikTok is a different platform from Facebook or Twitter. It's a different skill set. So there's another social media platform a reporter has to learn. So local journalists are not going to have this option to do all of that.
Yeah. I stay in touch with a lot of them still doing it, and the struggle is real. I feel so bad sometimes.
Yeah. And things happen on, trying to get something posted. It's if you make a typo or something, it's going to go out to the world, and that also eats up our credibility.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's and I wish I had an answer. Like I said, I don't have an easy fix for that, but we mentioned the misinformation and how it has hurt credible sources. The frustrating thing about it is with misinformation, it doesn't really have to be credible. Just like take the COVID vaccine, for instance, like overwhelmingly doctors, scientists, researchers, everybody's like, hey, this is safe, this is effective, you should do it. It's a no-brainer. But they are it's like the onus is on them to be completely transparent, completely accurate, and completely convincing, and even charismatic to an extent. Whereas with the misinformation side of things, all they really have to do is muddy the waters just a little bit. Because I can remember several times that I was dipping my toe into some of those conversations just that I get a feel for, where these people are coming from. And even though I've worked directly with researchers who are like studying not just the vaccine, but its effects. Like I know for a fact that this stuff works, but you get in there a little bit and it messes with your head. And that's really all it takes. All it has to do is doesn't have to even completely convince people that it's a deadly vaccine, which it's not. But if it just puts a little bit of doubt, that's all it takes for them to just not go.
Right. And, like we've talked about, they're looking at this information on Facebook. And so someone can mention in a Facebook comment of, oh, I had this symptom. Oh, I had that symptom, and then that gets people talking about this and that. And then all of a sudden you have someone who pops in and says, well, I read this source on such and such site. It's not a reputable news site, not even a reputable site in the first place. And they're citing information from it. And then that just grows and grows and grows. It's a giant game of telephone gone wrong. And I've been surprised when I've looked at some of the Facebook comments. Some of the comments I've seen on Facebook posts as well as in news stories are from people who I know should know better. And they're talking about questionable treatments or, pseudoscience. And I'm sort of like, wait a second, wait, what? And they're questioning the experts, which, obviously we probably do need to question sometimes some of the experts, but it's those comments that one person sees, then they're not doing the due diligence of fact checking. Right. And Facebook even did come out with, on almost every post that you even mentioned COVID-19, it pops up with this little, box that says, be careful, that little warning box. Well, even that's not foolproof sometimes. As I found out, one of my friends had posted something about she'd gotten her shingles vaccine. And all of a sudden, because the word vaccine was in her post, the COVID box popped up. She was talking about the shingles vaccine instead.
Yeah, the algorithm is far from perfect.
The algorithm is far from perfect. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, Facebook is a frustrating monster for me these days.
It is. And, that I think that has led into, of course, like the vaccine hesitancy. But if you look at some of the history, vaccine hesitancy is not new. I was reading a Dallas Morning News article about this, and Mary Healy, who's an assistant professor at Texas Children's Hospital in Houston, said vaccine hesitancy is doing a lot of damage. That's translating to illnesses and hospitalizations. It's translating to death. And so when that misinformation gets amplified on, social media, then that spreads because people are turning to social media to get their news rather than turning to their local newspaper where those reporters have done their due diligence. They're interviewing the doctors, they're interviewing the researchers, they're interviewing the frontline people and telling the story in a fact-based way, but yet people are going to go read on social media instead of picking up a newspaper that has actually been reported, fact-checked, and hopefully edited correctly.
Yeah, that's a frustrating thing with me when I know the effort that goes into these articles at every level, but I especially know at the local level. I know the interviews they conduct, referring back to information, citing sources and all that. And then when people say, I don't trust them, I trust JoeBlow.com, it just, I don't know. It's a little bit biased for me since I know I worked in there and I know firsthand, but it just kind of infuriates me. It's like, well, these people, they're working really hard to make sure they're as accurate as possible. This other one is really just trying to get you revved up about something.
Right. And that's where I think we as journalists, we also have a duty to rebuild the trust in our own communities about what we do. And there's a big movement in journalism to go about doing just that, to rebuild that trust, because journalists are no longer trusted.
Yeah.
And so some of the ways that we can rebuild trust, according to Trusting News, which is led by Joy Mayer and Lynn Walsh, they have several suggestions for newsrooms, and they work with newsrooms about how newsrooms can rebuild that trust. And some of those methods are like writing like explainer pieces. How did we choose our sources? How did we report this? Kind of taking opening the curtain back and letting people see our process. And then, making sure that we have on our websites a good About Us page that is up to date, tells who we are, what we're doing, maybe even a mission statement, clarifying our policies on corrections, because, we do get it wrong occasionally. I've done it. My husband has done it. You've done it. All of us it's to be human is to be a journalist is to be human. And you're going to mess up a name. You're going to mess up something because we have so much information. But we need to make sure that we're owning up to it and we have a correction policy and we're using those corrections in the paper. At the Sun, when I was there, they were on the front page. And as a reporter, that struck the fear into you that you did not want to end up in that correction box, because it was like, whoa, everyone's got to know I messed up a name. But it's all those little processes that I think sometimes somewhere along the way, maybe we just got busy, we forgot. And it's really been refreshing to see what they're doing, what they're pushing out to newsrooms and working with newsrooms to reestablish this trust, which hopefully will help us with this misinformation problem that is an epidemic in our country.
Yeah, it is. And it's been, I don't think there's any arguing about it. It's been deadly. Because how many people were lost to COVID who might not have this year because the vaccine, it's right there, it's available, we know it works. How many lives might have been saved if there'd been more of a push early on, or maybe better yet, if there hadn't been such a misinformation push early on, maybe there would have been a bottleneck, people would have been lining up for it, and maybe a few 100,000 people would still be alive. And then, we mentioned the January 6th thing. I believe it was 8 people lost their lives in that. And how would they all still be alive if misinformation hadn't been so prevalent? And I would argue yes.
Yeah, that was the weirdest thing ever. I was sitting at my kitchen table, had just finished lunch. I was prepping classes for spring semester, didn't realize I still had the news on, and just happened to glance up and I was like, oh, what movie is this? And I was like, oh, wait, that's not a movie. That's news.
My wife texted it to me. That's how I found it. I was driving and I got this text from her and I looked at it like, oh, well, that's bad, but I'm driving, so I can't answer. And then I think, 5 minutes later, she calls me. Did you get that text? Like, yeah, I got it, but I'm driving. That's a huge deal. I know, but I was just driving. I wasn't ignoring it.
Yeah, I think I texted my mom because I know she usually she's a retired journalism professor as well, a former journalist, longtime high school journalism teacher. Texted her to see if she was watching the news, to ask her. I was like, wait, did I just see this? Even though it was on the news, I still had disbelief because it was so surreal. And you just had to wonder what drove us to this point. And it gets right back to this, you know, issue with the misinformation. People were on different social platforms and different websites, different chat websites where they were talking about these things. And I don't know if you saw a couple of weeks ago, the QAnon stuff coming out of Dallas, that theory.
That was disheartening and funny at the same time.
Yeah, first time I read it, I was like, wait a second. Then I was like, oh, okay. I was like, okay. And then I thought, wait a second, there are people who believe this?
Yeah.
But it's something that it took hold somehow, some way. As a former journalist, I don't really understand how, but it took hold. And that's what we're fighting against in journalism is we need to be properly informing our customers or our audience, because they're going to go somewhere else and find what they agree with in today's world.
Yeah, and social media makes that very easy. We mentioned the algorithm with Facebook, and one of the big things that came out was that it intentionally would boost posts that created controversy because they called it engagement. But what that was just people were quicker to respond because they were angry. So you get them worked up, you get higher engagement, and they made more money. And that was a big part of their model. And, who cares about the consequences, but here's where we are. And that's the problem with social media. It's also designed to, it recognizes what you like, what you respond to, and that's what it feeds you. It's not an objective tool. None of them are. And if all you want to see is a certain side of the world, then that's what you're going to get. And it's also going to feed it to you in a way where you start thinking ill of that other side of the world. And that's a problem that has definitely not gone away. If anything, it's worse, but hopefully knowing it's a problem now, maybe that's the first step, they say. That's always the first step to fixing a problem.
Yeah, we could definitely hope so, but I think too much has happened, and we are so reliant on our social media. Mm-hmm. And that's where, and I had to have to look the stat up again, but it's been increasing, I believe, since 2014 from the Pew Research Center on the number of Americans who are getting their getting their news from social media. And it has just continued to increase.
Yeah, the only thing I can think of would be to train people from an early age. Like, look, this is not where you need to get your news. Because I distinctly remember when I was in high school writing term papers, the internet was just starting, dating me, showing how old I am there. But they said you can cite maybe 2 websites, but everything else has to be from an encyclopedia because we don't know how much we can trust the internet. And I've just wondered, why were we so conscious about making sure the internet was reputable early on, and then we just sort of lost that over time? Like, it seems like we should be, I don't know, the natural thing to me should have been to be more skeptical throughout as the years went on, as more and more got on there, because there was never any kind of filter. You can put anything you want on the internet.
Right. And that's the one thing too, is we work with our students with teaching them how to spot fake news. Mm-hmm. And I think this is going to be another growing movement coming. It already is here. Media literacy. We need classes in media literacy, and I think it needs to start as early as middle school.
I agree.
That's where people start getting into social media, even late elementary. But media literacy would go a long way in helping to address some of these issues. And we actually have a new media literacy class that will be starting in the fall at Murray State in our department, Media Literacy and Society. And I think that should be a class. It's going to be in our university studies curriculum. And I think it's going to be a fantastic class. I would love to see more media literacy classes across all of the spectrums, so that students are exposed to, how to properly read a news article, how to judge what's a news article, what's fake, how to detect doctored photos, how to detect doctored videos, how to, determine when something is just too outlandish to be true. And, you and I both know that there are like legit weird stories in the news. I mean, legit weird. We've covered them. But, if we teach students those skills early on, that might go a long way in making them think more critically about what they're consuming. And then maybe they can educate some of the older relatives who have fallen into the rabbit holes.
That'd be great. And if I could add to that, a civics course, just so that we know how basic government works.
Yes. I believe that has been forgotten somewhere.
I won't claim to know all the ins and outs of the governing process, but I know enough of it. I know the basic skeleton, I guess, so that when they tell me a process that I wasn't familiar with, it at least makes sense to me because I know it's based on, the democratic system.
Yes.
But I think that's a lost on too many people right now.
Well, and we've become such a polarized and politicized society somewhere along the way.
People, that's an argument I have gotten into with some people where they say, well, it's too complicated. The whole system, it's far too complicated. And my answer is always like, well, that was kind of the point. It was supposed to be complicated so that one person couldn't come in and just do whatever they wanted while they were in charge. It was supposed to be this way so that everybody had to work together. And yeah, that very concept in our polarized society is, boy, that's been, people not liking that to me is definitely a bad thing.
Yeah. We have some work to do, obviously.
But anyway, local news in these times, local news was always important. It informed you about your community. But I feel like right now it's more vital than ever, especially with our hyper politicized and polarized environment, because as even local governance is getting to be this way. Governing bodies that were traditionally just nonpartisan and people actually appreciated that fact. Well, now they want to move toward politicizing those, like even at school board levels, and like in Tennessee, that was a big move. And with these things happening, I just think it's more important than ever, because without local journalism, without community news, they have no accountability. It's not the same as at the national level where there's so many people watching them. At the local level, the only people watching your city council, your school boards, is your local newspaper, your local radio. Even television, I'm not knocking television, but television is regional and they have like certain time limits they got to work within. Nobody is really going to be on top of your local news and keeping tabs on local government as effectively and consistently as like newspapers, radio, community news.
Yeah, exactly. And I think you hit the nail on the head. And because it is the accountability, we are the local watchdogs in our community. So, they know that we're going to be there. They know that they have to follow the procedures. They know they don't need to close a meeting because we'll say, excuse me, according to, Kentucky Open Meetings, da, 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 da. Or, if we're looking for records, we're going to use those records requests to get information. We are the watchdogs. And when we aren't there, that is typically when stuff starts to happen. And it is getting to be increasingly difficult sometimes to be there because a lot of newsrooms during the pandemic and even before that had started to cut staff. And so here in Murray, I believe city council was last night and both school boards were last night. So how do you get all, 2 reporters to cover 3 meetings? Hopefully, maybe they have someone who's working with them part-time, but I mean, that gets to be an issue when you have multiple meetings on the same night. Do you pick and choose? Mm-hmm. But again, we need to be at these meetings, even if nothing happens. And you and I have probably both covered a lot of these government type meetings where nothing happened.
Oh, most of the time, nothing happened. But
yeah. But the fact that we're there tells them that we are watching and that we can help to get their message out, as well as letting people know what's happening. Because, when you go to these meetings, typically people only show up for the public hearing when they're mad about something, when they're mad about a tax, or they're mad about a school policy, or they're going to be tearing down a school to make room for a new school. That's when people come. They don't come to the regular meetings where they're just paying the bills. They come for the big issues. But if we're not there to let people know when that big issue is going to go through without anybody standing up and saying, we don't like this. This is not a good use of our taxpayer money, or, this goes against the best interest of our community. When we aren't there, that, like I said, that's when things can happen, and we have to be there.
Yeah, and arguably all those meetings we were at where nothing happened, it could be because we were there that nothing happened. Like nobody took advantage of anything because they knew there was accountability.
Right. And accountability journalism remains as important, if not more important than ever.
Yes, absolutely. So yeah, we need our local journalists, and in these times of with misinformation as prevalent as it is, I don't know, just over time I've always harped on this. They're the most important journalists out there, and it just seems to be more and more important. They just increase in importance in my eyes as time goes by.
Definitely. We have to have journalists. I keep saying that on some of my social media posts. I'm like, we need journalists. And it's really true. We need journalists to be out there telling the stories, especially at the local level. Things like tax bills not going out in time, that becomes a story. People are wondering, where's their county tax bill or city tax bill? That's a story. The whole thing with the school boards right now, there's been a lot of issues with the masking. Do we, reporting on those policies? Parents need to know that information.
Mm-hmm.
And so we have to be there. I mean, our job is so important, and it's such a vital job that newsrooms really do need to invest in more journalists at the local level rather than less journalists at the local level.
Absolutely. And I wish I had an answer, because I do sympathize with, the issue of revenue, but gosh, they're so important, and we definitely need them.
We definitely need them. And hopefully I'll be turning out some. They'll be going to local newsrooms soon.
I'm sure you'll turn out a lot of good ones.
Certainly hope so.
Well, thanks so much. This was a great conversation. Looking back and talking about the big issues of the year, and definitely the biggest was misinformation. I think we talked about that ahead of time. COVID was definitely big, but it was definitely impacted by misinformation along with everything else this year.
Right. And I have not a clue. I don't really want to look into the future on what 2022 will bring. Who knows? But I do hope that we do reinvest in local journalism, and especially local accountability journalism at that.
Yeah, me too. Well, thanks again. You have any closing thoughts though before we end this conversation?
I'm happy that you asked me to be on here. It's always a great conversation to talk about subjects that are near and dear to my heart as a journalism professor and a recovering community journalist. There are days I want to get back out there.
I know the feeling. Well, thanks so much. I appreciate it.
Okay. Thanks so much, Matt.
Hey, if you haven't already, be sure to visit the official Shore Manor online t-shirt shop, the purveyors of all things spooky and all things Halloween, as long as it's in t-shirt form. You can find it at mattshore.net. Just click on shop at the top of the page. And while you're there, be sure to use the promo code journalist and get 10% off of everything in the store. Once again, that's mattshore.net, and click on shop at the top of the page. All right, thanks, Lee. Thanks for a great chat and a stroll down memory lane in the journalistic field that was 2021. It was a pretty eventful year, and I wish that we could say that all the news was good, but as you can see, far too much of it was not. Now, that's not to say there was all bad news this year. There was a lot of good news that came out this year. It's easy to overlook that in the face of the bad. For instance, some really good news that happened was the vaccine. That was astronomically good, and more people are vaccinated at this point, and that's going to lower the infection rates, which is going to in turn lower the deaths related to COVID-19. Another great thing about that is that we have more treatments. So many different treatments that are coming out now and ways to contend with this virus. So that's good. And infection rates were in fact going down. Now, as this podcast goes out, we're in the middle of a winter surge, which is both unfortunate and expected. That sort of thing is going to happen in the colder months when people stay indoors. But again, the virus was on its way down, and hopefully once the winter passes, we'll see that decline happen once again. So, a lot of good news on the virus front. It's just easy to overlook it just with the frustrations of being boxed in with this pandemic the way that we have been for a couple of years now. But anyway, like I said, a lot of good news, a lot of good things, and it's important not to overlook them. One thing I'll revisit, I often say this to people when they ask who the most reliable news sources are, and I always say it's your local news, and I still firmly believe that it's absolutely the people within your community. Those are the news entities that have a stake in the well-being of their neighbors and their people. They're not somebody sitting in an ivory tower in some metropolitan somewhere off on top of a mountain or whatever. They're right there with us. So we know them, they know us, we're all connected and we know what's going on. Those are your most reliable sources. Now, sometimes people do kind of press, they want to know what's the most reliable national news source. And if you want, I'll go ahead and put that out there. It's not really a secret. In my humble opinion, the absolute most reliable one you're going to find, non biased, is the Associated Press. Bar none, they're the number one. And in fact, all the time that I was working with newspapers, the two editors that I worked for, the attitude was always, until the Associated Press says it didn't happen. I mean, they're not perfect, they make mistakes, but they strive very hard to maintain a level of journalistic integrity, and nobody else really comes close to that. Yeah, and they're going to be the top dogs. Written and printed news, Associated Press, they're your best. If you want to go beyond that, USA Today does a very good job. And if you want television news, for the most part, I'm going to tell you that television news is not your best avenue if you want reliable, never mind non-biased. The 24-hour channels are going to be absolute worst. But if you do want to pick one that is fairly down the middle and does a pretty good job overall, it's NBC News at this point. Now that could change, but at the moment, NBC News is the most reliable, and it's probably because they're not having to fill 24 hours worth of content. They just have, a couple of programs that they do throughout the day, and that's it. So they're your best. But again, you're not going to get the full story with television news nearly as well as you are in print news. So I firmly recommend, if you're going to look for news, look for it in print, look for it from the Associated Press, and look for it locally. All that said, I want to thank everyone for a great year. 2021 is almost in the books for us, and I won't be back until 2022. So thanks for checking out this podcast throughout the year. And we'll just move on to the cheap plugs. This podcast is a production of Shore Manor Studio, which does have its own YouTube and Facebook channels. Please go check those out. Go to facebook.com/Shore Manor. And on YouTube, the easiest way to find us is tinyurl.com/Shore Manor YouTube. Go check those out. Give us a subscribe, follow us, make me very happy, and it would make my wife happy. So you guys would actually be making me a bit of a hero to my wife. I would love that favor. Please do that for me if you could. Thank you so much in advance. If you wanted to follow me, there are some great ways that you can do so. First and foremost, I already mentioned this, but there's my website, mattshore.net, which has all the information you could possibly want about me. You can also shoot me an email at mattshore@hotmail.com. And if you're on social media, here are a handful of ways to follow me there. First, there's Twitter. You can follow me there at the Matt Shore. You can follow me on Instagram at the Shore, and now you can follow me on TikTok at the one Matt Shore. That's the numeral one Matt Shore. So once again, thanks for listening to this episode. Thanks for checking us out throughout the year. I really appreciate your support. And as we close out one more year, another year is in the books. Keep listening and keep reading. Thanks.